So let me tell you a little bit about Andrea. After graduating with an English degree from Barnard College, Andrea began working in television. She's worked as a producer and writer for PBS in Chicago, CNN in Washington, D.C., and WPEC-TV in West Palm Beach. She has won several professional awards, including 4 Midwest Emmys and a Peter Lisagor Award from the Chicago chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2000, she was awarded a journalism fellowship to the University of Michigan. Her travel writing and lifestyle stories have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, Daily Herald, Midwest Living, and Chicago Parent magazines, and cruisecritic.com. So it's my pleasure to welcome Andrea to the stage. And I want to remind everyone to please mute your electronic devices.
Thanks, Svetlana.
Hi.
Hi. So this is nice to finally do this. We've talked about it for a while.
Indeed,
so, yeah.
indeed. Well, so you have been a journalist for 30 years, and I want to know what brought you into the profession. How did you start?
Well, I can't say that it was like a lifelong goal. I wasn't certain what I wanted to do. I did have an English major in college, so I guess my senior year in college, I did an internship at the PBS NewsHour in New York City, and then from there, I was just kind of on a TV track. I went to work after that internship. I worked at CNN, and then a local news affiliate in Florida, and then I moved to Chicago when I married Rick, and after 3 jobs in TV, I had basically decided that the only place I wanted to work in TV was PBS, and if that wasn't going to happen, then I was going to try to do something different. But I had 3 experiences so far in TV, and PBS just it felt like a different experience, and the only way that I wanted to work in that medium. And so it took me a few months, but I got a job at Channel 11 as a producer and a writer they have a nightly news show called Chicago Tonight. And then I stayed at PBS for about 20 years doing various things, both a producer for Chicago Tonight, and then there was an arts show that I was the producer of, so I was there for many years.
So you mentioned your role as a producer. What does a producer do?
Well, it can be, lots of different things. From it can be going out with a camera crew and doing video packages where you do the interviews, and then you write a script for a taped package that runs, or it could be booking the guests who come on a program. So if you watch. If you see the talking heads that are on TV, somebody has to call around, see who the experts are in this field, see who's able to make their point well, interview them over the phone, get notes together, give them to the host, so it can be that too. So there's a wide range of what it
And how would you decide, are you also the decision maker for what stories are going to be
usually that's a group process. In a good place, it would be a group process, right? So at Chicago Tonight, there are some stories that are planned out, a week in advance, that are a little more evergreen, as we would call it, so it's not as tied to the day's news. But then every day, there's a meeting early in the morning where it's decided what, a good 50 to 60% of the show is going to be for that evening.
And then you're involved in editing. You mentioned that you write the script for the actual, kind of the flow of the program, I guess. And then do you also edit? Do you kind of put all the film bits together?
Sure. Well, certainly that's one of the many things that technology has, how it's changed my industry. I mean, when I started as a journalist right out of college. I was working on a typewriter, and there was a clear path of who the video editors were, who the cameramen were. But if you go into Channel 11 now and most TV stations, the desktop computer has an editing system on it, and the producers do preliminary video editing, and then you take it down to the person who is still called an editor, but you've already done kind of the first pass that they used to do, and then they just kind of finish it up.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so 20 years you worked for PBS, or you worked for Channel 11.
Right.
And then at some point you made a transition to a freelance version of your career. So tell us how that happened, why that happened.
Well, you know, throughout the time that I was at PBS, so it was basically my first job out after CNN and then the station in Florida. I went to PBS, and I was probably about 25 when I started working there. And so I had been there almost 20 years, and throughout the time I thought, golly, at some point would be good for me to try to do different things and explore different outlets. But it worked out well with, I had 2 young children, and Channel 11 was always really amenable to letting me work part-time and having a flexible schedule. Well, in 2010, the state decided to cut the budget entirely. So we had about a 15% layoff, and that included me. I was producing a show called Arts Across Illinois, and the sole underwriter for the show was the Illinois Arts Council. So we lost the entire budget. So I became a freelance journalist, and that's when we had our 3rd child, Sarah Sophia, and that actually, in many ways, it was a perfect timing for me, because I was home with her, and I saw it as an opportunity to really try to explore some more writing, and writing for maybe print or online or magazines. And I had no interest in going back to a 9-to-5 job where I was going to be going to an office. I really liked the idea of trying to see if I could carve out a career path where I would be an independent journalist, where I was basically working from my home. And now I continue to do a lot of work for Channel 11. That's the only place that when I work for them, I actually have to go to an office. The rest of the time, you know, I could be sitting at home in my pajamas doing most of my job. You know, occasionally I do actually have to sit down and I interview people in person. Most of the time I can interview them on the phone. Yeah.
I mean, it just seems, being self-employed, to me, my personality just seems really scary. But obviously you're very entrepreneurial, so how did you go about developing this new career? I mean, literally, like, day 1, day 2, year 1, where did this, walk us through the process for getting that off the ground.
Sure. Without a doubt, you have to, when you're an independent, I think whenever you have your own business, you have to be really pushing yourself, because if you're not pushing, it's not going to happen. You don't have a boss who's telling you, I need this tomorrow, I need this next week. It's up to you to be reaching out to people. So immediately when I was laid off, I mean, I was home. We had just adopted Sarah Sophia. Within a few weeks, I had actually already told the people at Channel 11 that we are leaving in a few weeks to go to Colombia, where our daughter is from. And so I was home with her, but I was also reaching out to introducing myself to editors, reaching out to anybody that I knew in Chicago.
Of course, you already had a reputation and you had a portfolio of work, so
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I had for years already been thinking, boy, I'd love to do a few travel stories a year. I wonder if I could do that. And of course, my boss at Channel 11 kind of felt like, no, you have a job here. You cannot do outside writing, So I felt like I had talked about that would be nice. That's what I'm going to pursue. So I got my first travel story with the Chicago Sun-Times about a year after being laid off. I had my first travel story published with them. And I had pitched a story to them about, I had read that the U.S. was going to be sinking their first ever naval ship in a foreign country that would be used as an artificial reef in the Cayman Islands. And I am a certified diver, so I had approached the travel editor and I said, can I do this story? You know, and I did not have any idea how this was all going to work out. And you know, the editor said, okay, can I have the story in about a month? And I said, nope. I'm thinking more like, I'm thinking that I want to cover the airfare for my family and bring my family along to the Cayman Islands so I can get it to you after spring break ends in May. And she said, okay. And so then that was pretty much, I think, one of the first, up until then, every trip we had ever taken was visiting family, which we were blessed that we had family who was in Florida and Arizona. So that was all we did for our vacations, and that, of course, we were very blessed to have that. So that was the first time we had gone on, you know, something, a jaunt like that, and it was unbelievable. And I definitely, after experiencing that, had kind of got bit by the travel bug. And so now I continue to do, I would say about a quarter of my work is travel writing.
So like cruise critic, is that?
Cruise critic, I write, I continue to write for the Chicago Tribune, occasionally travel, Midwest Living Magazine, I've done even Midwestern travel, family vacation critic, lots of different outlets. You know, after another travel writing gig that I got shortly after the Sun-Times, my boys had been, when they were growing up, used to go skiing up at Wilmot every weekend. And we always talked about, one day we're going to take a real ski trip. And so I had pitched, Park City Mountain Resort said they were looking for writers who would write a couple stories for them, and in exchange, it would go on their website, and they said, in exchange, you get ski passes for the whole year, we'll fly your family out there, we'll put up the lodging, we'll purchase the rental car. I said, okay.
Right, so basically
So
they
that
pay
was
you
it.
in kind
Yes,
for
they
your
paid
story.
me for each one of their posts on their
Yeah.
website. So I got money for that
Oh, you
as
did,
well.
in addition to.
In addition to that, they paid for the ski trip. So that was our first, you know, big real ski trip. And so we've had a lot of amazing adventures because of the travel writing. But I still write, you know, I write lifestyle and feature stories for the Chicago Tribune, for some North Shore magazines. I'd say about a quarter of my work is still at Channel 11, filling in at Chicago Tonight whenever they need a producer there. Yeah.
So I'm curious, like maybe tell us about a recent or not so recent, like one of the more memorable life interest stories that you wrote, and kind of walk us through the process. You know, how do you think of an idea, then you pitch it, then you get the assignment, and then you start. You know, I'm curious to know your process in researching and putting together a story.
Sure. It's different case by case. You know,
Well, come up with, like, remember
the story that I just turned into the Tribune a couple weeks ago was about, I had gotten a press release saying that that Chicago is getting its first Spanish language immersion daycare, a private one, you know, a year round, where the teachers spoke nothing but Spanish, and primarily was native English speaking kids. And so I had pitched the Tribune, and she said, I think that's interesting, and I did a the story entailed, not just about that daycare, but about how you raise children to be bilingual. I interviewed folks from the Erickson Institute, which is a child development graduate program. So that was one example. The story before that I did for the Tribune was about a couple months earlier, I had been asked by North Shore magazine to write a story about a tutoring lounge that had opened on the North Shore. Mm-hmm. And in the process of writing the story, the owner of the tutoring lounge said to me, "This is the world's first, members-only tutoring lounge." And I had, seen the photographs of it. And, for the North Shore magazine, it was just a business story about this, what I at the time felt like, that's a interesting, development. These people pay a couple $100 a month for their kid to be able to hang out in this really cool hip space. And they described it as that they would have, like an Apple store, they would have tutors kind of roaming around and on demand, and all you needed to do is push on your kid would have on their phone an app that said homeworks. The app is called Homework Sucks, and you push a button and you can buy a half-hour tutoring session for $50. Just by pushing the button.
So on top of membership,
on top of the membership.
Okay.
So the North Shore magazine just wanted this as a business profile of this guy who used a lot of, MBA words about being a disruptor in the industry and that sort of thing. So I give them what they want. That's all they want. A couple months after delivering that story, the college admissions scandal broke out. Right. I immediately contacted my editor at the Tribune, and I said, "I think I got a story for you about that just follows up with other things that have been in the news about the advantages that the obvious advantages that wealthy children are always getting." Always getting.
Right.
And so then I did that story for the Tribune.
Oh, so you were able to take the story that you had done for
I didn't write the same story.
But you
the
were
story
able to
was
take
completely different.
Right, but
with
it's
the tutoring lounge just being one small element.
Got it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it was the hook at the very beginning of the story. Mm-hmm. and then it was also including quotes from authors and economists who talk about mm-hmm. how the U.S. is, it sells itself internationally as a meritocracy, but that we are increasingly, with the rise of tutoring and many other things, and the college admissions scandal somewhat exposed that it is not exactly a meritocracy for everybody. So,
right.
Anyways.
Right.
Yeah, so that was an example of that I had done
right.
a story for somebody else. And that's, of course, in the world of being a freelance journalist, that's exactly what you want to do, is you want to try to sell a story, craft it in different ways, but sell it repeatedly to different outlets. Mm-hmm. That's what you're hoping to do.
And, how do you know when you've interviewed enough people, consulted with enough experts? How do you know when your research is done?
Sure.
Art more than a science,
it
presumably?
It is, and sometimes you'll think it's done, and then the editor will say, will recommend interviewing somebody else. That will happen.
Okay.
But it's left up to the writer to just, do I feel like is this piece rich enough?
Yeah, you just sort of, that's kind of, that from experience. Right, and of course you mentioned there are editors, there are fact checkers, there are people who then go in. Have you ever had, you got something wrong, and have you ever had things happen where you reported on something or you misunderstood something? Sometimes in the current media climate, that often gets, I think, discovered much quicker, where some author somewhere makes a comment or writes something, and then people are able to identify an error.
I've never had anything major. I've never had a retraction, if that's, I've never had a retraction happen. I have, an editor has caught me on a typo, that before it ever went anywhere, but I've never had a retraction.
Right. Yeah. Well, and also the fact checkers are supposed to check whenever, you know. Yeah, it's a really interesting process. And I mean, do you feel just generally that there's, you know, the pace of news is faster, the competition is really quite significant. I mean, do you feel that pressure? Do you feel the overall kind of what appears to be a very different, much more sort of pressurized environment to turn out, you know, clickable stories? I mean, do you feel?
You know, I think I would if I was sitting in an office where they were trying, you know, an internet outlet that was trying to do that. I think I would, but you know, I'm working from home on longer pieces with, you know, usually when I get an assignment, it's a month out. You know, we want this in 4 weeks or even 8
and it's
weeks.
not a current news.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't
maybe.
I don't have, other than Channel 11, that's the only
Right.
place where I go in, we decide that morning what I'm doing, and then I have to have it ready by the end of the day. You know, but other than that, I get several weeks to kind of, you know, do a little research, and then it's not what I don't work on it full time for 4
Right.
weeks, but I don't have to deliver it for several weeks.
Right. Right. You have the
You
luxury
know, so I can
of.
just at my own pace, you know, do a little research, start sending out some emails. You know, I don't feel like it's like an urgent thing that needs to be done that
You're
day.
under the gun, yeah. Well, I mean, what, in terms of like personality characteristics that make a good journalist? Like, what would you say?
No, you have to like talking to people.
You'll have to like
right?
talking to people, for sure, yes.
Right, because you get put into every different kind of situation.
But you also have to know how to
But
answer.
of course, that's also the beauty of it, is that it's like
Mm-hmm.
a license to talk to people about stuff that you would never talk to people about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of my stories a couple years ago for the Chicago Tribune, and this is one that they came to me about. This was after there was a story about a Christian blogger who had revealed it was in a marriage with 3 kids, and revealed that she was now in a loving relationship with Abby Wambach, who is the top female soccer player in the U.S. And so my editor said, the Trib wants something on this. And I said, well, what? She's like, just think about it. Just see if there's something that you could do with this. And at first I thought, I don't even know if I'm going to take this assignment. I said, give me 24 hours. And so I contacted a friend of mine who is gay, and she said, why don't you reach out to the center on Halsted, which is the community center on Halsted. So I quickly called over there, and I said the situation I was in, and I said, I'm not really sure where to go with this. And they said, well, you know, we have a support group for fathers who are in heterosexual marriages with children who are either thinking they may be gay or have already told their family they are gay. And I said, well, I think that's a story. So I went back to my editor, and we ended up doing that story, and it was really beautiful, and it was one of the stories where I definitely felt like I need to meet this person I need to meet this guy in person. I'm not going to do a phone call. That I
This
needed
guy
to establish
being the person about who
the
you
father who he's the person who had set up this support group. And so we met in person, and he told me his life story, and it was really a beautiful story. That's the kind of thing I never would have been able to sit down and talk to somebody about
Right.
that. You know, it was like many, you know, stories, just an eye-opener for me and a life lesson, and I hope from every assignment I get that I'll get some of that, you know, but some more
Right.
than others.
So you have to like to talk to people. You also have to, I guess, be really quite open, because I would imagine when you're interviewing someone, you can't necessarily, you can't react the way that you might in a non-professional situation, right? So you have to be kind of empathetic, kind of,
right. Well,
like,
in
you
this
know, how do you,
case,
what is your
that was part of
demeanor,
why I felt
right?
like
What if you were,
I needed to actually sit down with him,
right,
and see him face to face,
right.
And I just felt like having the conversation on the phone, I might not have gotten the
kind
same
of rapport,
conversation going.
Right.
Yeah.
But have you ever interviewed someone you didn't like, someone you weren't necessarily sympathetic to, and you had to elicit information without judgment? Do you know what I mean?
All the time.
Okay.
All the time.
And so how do you do that? How do you keep, like, you know,
Well,
you've
it's a
just
living.
furrowed your
It's
brow.
just a job.
Right, so you're able to.
It's a job. And and sometimes I am offered assignments that I really, don't want to be involved in, and then I don't take them.
Could you give us an example of something you turned down?
A North Shore magazine had asked me to profile a business owner who was it was a medical doctor who I felt was really trying to sell products that had no scientific basis whatsoever, and I did not want my name attached in any way to it. So I did not do that one.
Right. But otherwise, you just have to be able to maintain a demeanor that is
Sure,
inquisitive.
you're just telling me what
right.
you right.
Just, I mean, it's just
want to
interesting
hear
how
what
you have to
say
control
is
your
the way you
facial
have to feel about
expressions,
it.
you know? It's like, no furrowing of brows.
But that happens all the time, right?
Well, not in my job, for example. I mean, some jobs don't require that. I can furrow my brow all I want.
Yeah, well, in my job, yes.
Yeah,
I just
right.
go
No,
along
I
with
think that's a skill.
I
so
just
you
want to hear what they have to say.
Right. So you have to like to talk. You might have to be very curious, I would imagine.
Right.
Just a curious person, open person. What other
Right.
skills?
And I have to say that most of the time when you're doing lifestyle and feature stories, most of the time when you read the newspaper, a lot of the stories are, by the end, you're just, shaking your head. But the stuff that I write is usually the kind of stuff that by the end of the story, you're normally smiling. Occasionally you're not, but the tutoring lounge, you were not smiling at the end because I closed the story with a mention of the fact that another tutoring lounge is opening up in Highland Park and another one's coming to Lincoln Park. So that is not the kind of story at the end that you were smiling about.
Right.
But most of them you usually are, and that's kind of the difference with what I'm writing with, say, like investigative journalism. Most of the time with investigative stuff, at the end you're just, you're.
Right.
It's the reason
You're
why
distressed.
people are shaking their head at the newspaper.
Right.
But most of the stuff I'm doing is pretty usually positive.
If a young person wanted to get into journalism at this time, would you encourage them? Would you discourage them? What would be your advice?
Well, certainly in journalism, you don't have to have a journalism degree, and they tell you that all the time, that you're just as well off getting an economics or a history degree or an English degree. So you don't have to study journalism in order to be a journalist. And as far as the profession, I mean, it certainly is a profession that's in flux right now, and there's a lot, newspapers are, it's a hard time. The New Orleans Times-Picayune, which already a couple of years ago had gone from print to the web, just had their entire newsroom laid off, like in the last couple weeks, and they're just the last of many newsrooms that have had this sort of thing. The Trib had to move out of Tribune Tower, which was always a source of civic pride, to be down there. So it's a tough time for journalism, but I do think that in the long run, I think that people will always want to have decent information. But it can be a tough way to make a living. I think it's a great way to live, but it can be a tough way to make a living.
Agreed. In terms of the flexibility that's inherent, if you're freelance,
it's exciting. It's a license to talk to people about stuff you would never get to talk to people about. You're learning new things all the time. So the things that I'm doing are great, you know, but it is not an easy way to make a living.
Do you have views on sort of the big picture of like where newsprint does seem to be declining and possibly.
Yeah,
I
don't know. You know,
Yeah.
Certainly the internet is just driving everything. You know, I don't know if how the internet could affect, you know, the dissemination of information. I don't know if one day, you know, because of how I think people are being put into extreme camps on the internet, and you know, we're being fed the information they want, will headlines be different for one? The same story could have a different headline
It
for
does already.
you than for me, given what
I
your
see what
political
you're saying.
background
Right,
is.
right.
The exact same story. Well, is that the next thing that they know that, you know, John is a Republican, but he is interested in what's happening at Lincoln Yards, the development. But you know, Jane is a liberal progressive, but she doesn't want Lincoln Yards to be developed. Are they going to change the headline? I don't know what's going to happen in terms of how we all get our information. But it wouldn't shock me if something like that was the next thing, that we're somehow getting completely different information.
Well, I think people already are seeking out different sources of
Yes.
information, and so sometimes actually the same story, right, is presented. It can be presented with different emphases and different headlines. Do you think generally that there is such a thing as bias in the media, like broadly speaking?
I think that
I know we decided that we wouldn't
Right.
go into the big picture, but I'll throw out a few questions.
so. I think that there are places like for TV. I think that PBS really tries to, you know,
Be even-handed.
be ethical about it. But you know, even and they try to get people with different views. You know, I think even at the most ethical places, if you're talking TV, you know, I think it's unfortunate that in order to have a good debate on the PBS NewsHour, that could mean that you need to have two people from the extremes in order to have the debate, when I think that there might be a whole lot of people who are right in the middle. When it comes to abortion or foreign policy, I think that the vast majority of people are sitting somewhere in the middle, but oftentimes we have to get the people on the extremes of both sides so that they can have,
So they can generate
so that
fireworks.
they can have
so that,
a debate. So I don't think that's a bias. I think that that's just kind of the formula that's been created, which, but I think that most journalists are trying to present information in a good way. I do think that different mediums have, you know, different demands and constraints. One of the soon after I left Channel 11, there was a glossy magazine that I had pitched a story to, a profile of somebody, and I remember being pretty shocked when they then said, "We need to see a picture of the person before we can decide whether we would do an interview." And that, at Channel 11, would have been unheard of. The idea that we need to see what this person looks like before we decide that we would have them on the program. But I don't think that's unheard of in other TV stations. I think that, you know, if you were to go to some of the talk shows, I think that would be quite common, that they want to see
How photogenic.
how photogenic somebody is before they're going to invite them on. So that was an eye-opener for me. I was not used to that.
Do you think we should teach Do you think there's such a thing as consuming media in a kind of a skeptical, is there such a thing as media literacy? You know, should we be teaching how to, everybody, including young people, right?
Sure.
Where we have them
I mean, I
captive
think
in
that
the
could
high
be,
school.
I think that could be incorporated into, you know, a history class or a U.S. government class. You know, I don't think it has to be a separate class that's the journalism class, but it could be incorporated into a civics class, the idea of looking at different editorials. You know, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are going to have very different editorials. And
Those are editorials, but I guess I'm just thinking about, you know, how to consume news critically or skeptically, right? How to read, like, do you have any pointers on that, you know? You're reading a story, right? Your blood is up.
yeah.
What should
I mean,
you do?
I think that I think being educated and informed is the key. If you're constantly trying to educate yourself and inform yourself well, I think most people can tell, hopefully, when they're getting information that feels right, that feels like they're getting both sides. But, you know, even I think at the New York Times, you know, which is seen as kind of the gold standard in print, you know, I think that most people would say they're leaning left, and it would behoove you to also be looking at the Wall Street Journal occasionally.
You know, I have heard it said that if you read a story and you really like it, you should be particularly careful because it seems to be, then it's really speaking to one's internal biases, which one might not really be aware of. And if you're really zinging with a particular story, that's the time to go and maybe look further.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is I think that's kind of, you know, like, okay, this is really feeding my narrative. That's probably a dangerous path to go on, or potentially,
oh,
you know?
for sure. And as a journalist, I mean, without a doubt, when I do stories, I'm always amazed at how I might go into a story thinking that I have a certain opinion, and then I talk to several people, and I realize that it's always more complicated.
Could you give us an example of that kind of transformation, or just that kind of change of mind? That's really interesting.
Well, I feel like it's on a daily basis.
Yeah.
You know, all the time with Chicago Tonight, that would happen. If I would start with trying to book a segment, and I would think, oh, this must be the perspective on something. And then I would find out that there's, you know, I would talk to someone else who would give me a different perspective. And yeah,
so I guess a journalist really has to be very self-aware and not sort of pursue a story along a path that is sort of naturally appealing and that confirms
sure.
the narrative.
And that's why it's so
right?
important that, you know, that you have a diverse set of editors.
Right, the editor
So
that
that
looks
somebody, everybody comes from their own
necessarily, right? Perspective, of course, yeah.
And so it's good to have a very diverse newsroom where somebody could say, did you ever think about talking to this person for this story?
Right. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. I'm just going to glance at our time, and I can't, oh my goodness, the light is blinding me. Okay, all right. Well, is there anything, I think we're running pretty early yet, but that's all right. Is there anything that I haven't asked you? Well, I know. You sort of alluded to the fact that that you've been able to combine career and family in your life thus far. So tell us more about that. How, you know, you're a mom of 3 kids, and just, you know, kind of riff on that theme.
Yeah, well, without a doubt, being an independent journalist has really, I think, worked out well for my other family responsibilities, because it's given me complete flexibility and allows me to be in charge of my own schedule, and you know, if the story, that's part of the reason why I don't want to take a story that's due, you know, at the end of the week. I want to have a month so that if something comes up, if, you know, if somebody gets sick or they need a volunteer at school for something, I'm always available. Yeah, so that's been wonderful.
Well,
for
and
me.
I guess as your daughter is still young, obviously at home. Is she in elementary or middle?
She'll be in middle next year.
Right. Okay. So there's still a while, but eventually the kids are going to be out of the house. Do you think that you will have yet another chapter to your career, or do you think you'll retire? That's my plan.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, where I am right now, I'm pretty happy
Yeah.
with writing these stories, and I don't know why I would ever stop.
Right. So you can just do as much as
really,
you want,
I
or as
enjoy
little.
it, and when it feels like when I have a story come to me an assignment that I don't enjoy, I don't take it.
Yeah.
That's kind of where it is. The travel stories I would be happy to do until I die.
Yeah.
You know, why wouldn't I want to talk to anybody who has something interesting to say? That's
Yeah.
how I feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where it is. I don't know.
You are very lucky to have a career that you enjoy and that lets
I feel
you
that way too.
have truly a full life with your family and friends and whatever else you want to do.
I feel that way too.
So is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we
No, I think
before we
we've covered it. I
close?
think
Yeah.
that, you know, this is really, I approach this as it's just a nice way to get to know other members that we're seeing here, you know, every Sunday, and get to know how they incorporate, you know, the values that we have at EHS about trying to be rational and informed and compassionate. I feel like all the things that EHS is about is exactly what my career is about too. And that's nice.
Yes. And thank you for giving us a peek. I mean, we all read the news. We all consume a lot
and
of
of
different
course, as I
media.
had said to you, Svetlana, this is just my
Yes,
perspective.
of course.
You know, everybody has a different one. Bobby was telling me about his fiance who works at a local newspaper out in Frankfurt, Illinois, the designing, the graphic design, which I'm sure would have been done locally just a few years ago, is done in India every day, right? Or it's a weekly that they email them all the information and then it gets sent back. And so everybody, you know, depending on the outlet that you're working for, the experience can be very, very different.
Yes.
And I imagine that can be true in many professions. It may be more so that way in journalism. So what I started off by telling you that after working at three new TV stations, I decided, you know what, it's PBS or it's not for me for TV. Then I got to go somewhere else, you know. And as an independent journalist, you know, you can just walk away from an assignment or an outlet if it doesn't feel right, you know. And sometimes, you know, there's so much of a motivation now to get, you know, the clicks on things, and you know, you've got to find a way as a journalist to be comfortable with that you're doing a story, but that is ethically, but hopefully will still interest people enough that they will actually read it. Otherwise, these outlets are going to go out of business, you know? So that's a fine line that I'm always walking, and you know, new business models for these, for news outlets are constantly coming up. I mean, even the New York Times now with the wire cutter you know, they're making money off it. They're
Say
selling.
More. What is this?
You know,
the wire cutter?
Well, and they're just one example of newspapers and news outlets that they're essentially selling things. And they're making money off of recommending products. You know, and so I have done that myself I do now for the Tribune every year, a toy roundup. But I do actually, and of course this is Sarah Sophia's favorite story that I do every year, I look at the toys, I check out the toys, you know, and so there's
give
more
your
of that going on
unvarnished-
with the news outlets too,
Right.
that they're trying to find new ways
To generate revenue,
to generate
yeah.
revenue. You know,
Well-
and that happens with travel writing too, that I will do hotel reviews, but I will be honest, hotel reviews for sites that are essentially booking engines. That happens too, you know, and, you know, but I do try to give out all the information. If I write for Family Vacation Critic, I totally approach a hotel review from the point of view of, you know, would this work for a family? You know, are you going to be having a heart attack at night because the balcony looks like a kid could jump over the balcony? I would say that
Right.
you know, you're going to stay on the first floor. You're going to be frightened. You know, so I try to always be as honest as I can be and walk the line of that. I understand these outlets, they need to generate revenue or they're going to go the way of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, you know, or the Denver Post with their cutbacks, but still be ethical and honest. So that's it.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you
all.
so much.
That's my experience. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Andrea, thanks so much for sharing your experience with us. I'm struggle constantly with the question of when is there really not another side? So we don't now see articles in the newspaper about flat Earth. We've sort of just come to a global consensus that the world is round, even though there's a small flat Earth contingent who disagree. But no one bothers in a story to say, well, we talked to the flat earthers just 'cause. Like, we just don't do that anymore. And I feel like there's this perception that there's always a legitimate other side on most issues, even if I suspect 80% of people surveyed don't think the other side, whatever it might be, the flat earth, is legitimate. So how does at some point, how do news editors, publishers, journalists, when can you decide there's really not a legitimate other side that needs airing in an article?
I don't think that's an easy answer. I think that's just why you hope that, you know, the people who are in charge in newsrooms are well educated and have good judgment, because I don't think there's an easy answer to that, right? I mean, we're slowly approaching that a little bit with climate change, although there are still climate change skeptics, and there is a segment of the population that still believes that. But I think it's like every other career, you have to use your judgment every day on stuff like that. But not an easy answer.
Hi, thanks for doing it. Could you tell me how Chicago Tonight would cover a news day where the main news is that President Trump told a bald-faced lie? And it was a lie that's consequential. So how would you go about doing something like that where there's no dispute that what he said is wrong?
Sure. Well, first of all, Chicago Tonight, I'm going to go with the PBS NewsHour, because Chicago Tonight tries not to cover right after the NewsHour would have covered it, right? They try to stick with local. So I think the NewsHour has been trying to, I mean, I've seen their reporters say they will show a soundbite from Donald Trump, and then they will say that is not true. I've seen them do that. They'll say that's not true, but
they had two talking heads after, which they often do.
Yeah.
Do you have to provide someone that's going to say, yeah, he lied, but...
I don't, and
What
of
about
course
our email?
this depends on the outlet, but if you're going to go with PBS, they don't always. They try to have, if it's climate change, they won't have a climate extremist, a complete climate denier on, but they might have different viewpoints on it. And they definitely have been saying increasingly that what Donald Trump said today is untrue, that there's no evidence of it.
My question is regarding the way my generation perceives the media and the way we absorb kind of information. We, for example, like travel, we have a lot of bloggers and lifestyle bloggers and influencers on social media that seem to be driving and altering the conversation. And a lot of them have very biased perspectives because they are getting paid by the hotels they're going to and the places they're visiting. How do you think the best way to stay balanced in this situation is for the media specifically? Like, as a person that does write lifestyle and travel pieces, how do you try to not buy into what may have been an opinion that is swayed by an influencer?
How do I try to, what was the end of your question again?
How do you specifically try to stay unbiased and provide a perspective that is your own, even if like influencers are louder, because they do seem to be driving the conversation? It might just be from people my age's perspective and like in my sphere of existence, but they do seem to have a much larger footprint than the traditional media. So how do you think those two things could potentially play off each other?
I don't know. Certainly that's a tough thing. I think that, you know, if you were trying to get a job at a newspaper or any media outlet, if you come to them and you already have 40,000 followers on Twitter or Instagram, I think that, and this probably applies to many jobs, but certainly in the media, you're probably more like, it will certainly be in your favor in getting a job, right? In terms of, I try not to be swayed by influencers. Like, you mean like with travel writing? I only write about places that I've seen myself. So, so I wouldn't be swayed by an influencer, I don't think, as much, because I try to actually see the place, and then I will include how much, you know, how much it costs to stay there, and so then that's up to whoever the reader is, whether that's something that seems like a decent value for them, or if they'd rather save their money and do something else. I do think you know, what's been happening with social media and brand influencers, I would like to definitely see people more educated about what's going on, because I do think that a lot of people, especially kids, have no idea that a lot of the social media is compensated. And I think that I think it's the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that is supposed to be policing that. I think it should be policed more. And that people should actually be, you know, taken off of Twitter and off of Instagram if they're not properly identifying that they've been paid to post whatever they're posting. Because I think there's a lot of that going on.
Did I see your hand?
I think everyone would be interested to hear about how the compensation works. I think the question was getting at a little bit, and we at home talk about it all the time, although I know that sometimes Andrea's uncomfortable with this subject, but this question about who's getting what for free. So when you're reading an influencer, they don't tell you, they gave me this meal free. When you write, best meal I ever had,
Right.
Well, you didn't pay for it. And how does that work with the, you know, I'm specifically talking about it, as I'm sure you know, the policies of the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times,
every
other
outlet
travel
is
writers,
very different.
associations.
Yeah, every outlet is very different, and you know, I don't think that every outlet is different, you know, and we often will try to write that, you know, research for this article was, you know, we received assistance from the Tourism Bureau who maybe paid for a flight. But it's not always identified. And it's really, it is something that I think the FCC somehow has, I don't know how, but I do think it would be good for them to get more involved in with, you know, with influencers, you know, making it clear that if you are writing about a restaurant or a hotel, that if you have been paid to say that it needs to say advertisement in your social media.
What the policies are that you're being informed in. I don't know if you're avoiding saying, are people actually sticking to them, but there are policies.
Right. Well, I mean, are you talking about the New York Times?
New York Times is the best example.
So, I mean, this is kind of the sausage making that I hate to get into. But yeah, so the New York Times with travel writers has said, they claim officially that their policy is that nobody can receive any assistance from a tourism bureau, and none of their writers have for at least 2 years. But I don't quite believe that's true. Is that what you're trying to get at, Rick?
Yeah, what is the policy? You can tell your experience of writing for them and what they ask you to sign and what, or no, is that, I shouldn't be asking that?
Yeah, they wanted me
Okay,
to.
maybe we'll move on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, they wanted me to sign something that I would in no way ever work with a tourism bureau or anyone and I couldn't do that because they don't pay your expenses either. So they wanted you not to work with a tourism bureau on assistance for a flight, but they also wanted to just pay you $300-400 for a story. So it doesn't quite work, and they, you know, it puts the freelance writer, it's taking advantage of them because they're not paying the expenses, but they also don't want you to receive any assistance from anyone. So.
I wanted to ask, was there like a significant political event that you covered while you were at PBS, like you helped produce? That you were at, when you were at PBS, was there like a political event or a news story that was really significant that you were part of?
Golly. I'm trying to think. I mean, I was there when the Democratic Convention was in Chicago. What year was that? That was... No, I'm thinking there was a more...
96.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. 96, I was there when Princess Diana came into town, and we, and that was fun. And I'm trying to think, yeah, no, that was about it. The Democratic Convention was fun when I was here in town.
Thanks, Andrea. Great program this morning. If you're planning a trip, do you think you're more likely to get information without bias from money that's been paid if you get your information from a book as opposed to the internet?
We stumped you.
Yeah, no, not necessarily. I think that if you're looking at Lonely Planet and photos and that sort of thing, I think they're not paying the writers very much, so somehow I think they may be staying at the hotels for free. I think that you need to do a wide search, and I think that there are ways that the travel writers can be subsidized by a tourism bureau, but still get, you know, specific information out that the internet allows you to have very specific information about what you are interested in, right? That's the beauty of it. So like a cruise critic or a family vacation critic will give you exact details about that exact thing that you want. You know, if you go to Cruise Critic, I think they give out great detailed information. And it's the most recent. I think a book, I don't know, I think you're just as likely to get information that might, where the writer might have somehow been received part of the trip subsidized, as well as it's older than Cruise Critic or the newspapers. But I'm not certain, Marilee.
Hey, great talk. I'm gonna try to softball you, I swear. What was a trip that you were asked to write on that you were the most surprised by, whether good or bad, when you finally went on the trip and reviewed what you were supposed to review on it?
The trip?
Yeah, which was the most
Yes.
surprising. Yeah.
So I went to Panama several years ago, and I was just amazed at, you know, it seemed like it was Costa Rica, and it was as beautiful as Costa Rica. I went into, you know, we went on river cruises in the jungle. They had beautiful wildlife. The Panama Canal was amazing. There's a really cool museum that's been set up at the Panama Canal. So I kind of felt like, why is it that they haven't gotten more tourism? Why is Costa Rica getting all the tourism? Why haven't they been able to brand themselves as a great place to go? I mean, they had the, you know, they had the whole Noriega thing, right? Wasn't that right? So that was a problem. The U.S. invaded Panama. That kind of damaged them for a while. But I was surprised at how beautiful the country was and how much there was to do. It wasn't quite on my radar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm really happy for you that you can say no sometimes, that you don't have to always take whatever is thrust your way. How nice that must be to use the word no.
Yes, it's a luxury.
Yes.
And I realize that it's not a luxury that everybody has, you know, and that's not something that we've talked about too much. That, you know, I've tried to gently say that it's a nice way to live, to do this. It can be a tough way to make a living. That is honestly, you know, what's going on. And it could be a tough way to pay a mortgage.
Yes.
And car payments and health care and all that. But it's
In
working.
doing your research for whatever story that you're preparing, are there 2 or 3 different places that you go to get good, valid information?
You're talking about any story?
Where do you go? Like occasionally I'll do Snopes.com to find out if something that I'm reading on a Facebook feed is just crap.
No, I don't have, you know, I mean, I check the New York Times, the Economist. If I'm about to do a profile on somebody, I just do a wide swath of whatever comes up, and I take it all with a grain of salt, whether it's the New York Times or the Economist or a smaller magazine or website I've never heard of. It's all taken with a grain of salt. It might be right, it might not. That's how I view it.
Hi, Andrea. My wife and I were listening to NPR maybe a year or 2 ago, and they were interviewing kids in colleges, and the number one profession that was chosen was journalism.
And this is how long ago?
2 or 3 years ago. And
Okay.
the last profession that was chosen was internet data analysis. The number one pay was in data analysis, and the last pay was in journalism. And I'm just curious, what you know, and how do kids, what do they get paid? I mean, what do new reporters get paid? You don't have to give me your, you know,
Right.
your IRS form. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think that new reporters are getting paid probably like $30,000 a year. Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a career that the wages have completely stagnated, right? There are people, for independent journalists, are getting paid less per assignment now than they might have been a decade ago. Yeah, so.
I wonder if you might be aware of funding for PBS, how much comes from the government perhaps, how much from corporate sponsors?
I don't have the exact numbers
Okay.
on that.
Well,
I would not feel comfortable.
An alternate question. Do you think that corporate sponsorship of PBS might have any effect on the news coverage that it presents?
You know, I would say no. Other than when it's clearly said, this documentary on, you know, the Joffrey Ballet was underwritten by the, well, then you know that without the Chicago Community Trust money, they would not have been able to do that documentary. But I have never seen, during my 20 years at Channel 11 or when I interned at the NewsHour, I have never seen any corporate entity able to actually impact who gets invited on the show, what the copy says that is being read, nothing like that. You know, where they can impact things is they can say, we'll give you a grant for $100,000 to only do something on climate change. They'll tell you that this is what we're interested in hearing about. We want to hear about childhood development. But that's where it usually ends, and then usually there's no more meetings about what the exact topics are going to be. It's got to be broad enough that it's, you know, we want to do early education, and then you guys take it, and then the producers get to take it from there and come up with the topics. But corporate entities definitely can say, this is a broad idea that we want to see more coverage of, but then at PBS at least, they don't get to have any input in the actual details of the coverage.
Yeah, this sort of feeds off Matt's question too, and maybe the last one also, but the general finances of generating news. I mean, traditionally, newspapers have been the source of originating news, investigative journalism, really finding out what's happening and generating the stories.
Yeah.
And that's been financed by subscriptions and advertising in the print medium.
Right, and the classified ads, I mean, that's all gone out the window.
So that's all going away, and now we have all sorts of news sources, I'll use air quotes here, on the internet, but it's not original news. It's all spinning what was reported somewhere else or just making it up. So I guess my question is, with the changing economics of the whole business, should we worry about actually finding out news anymore? I mean, the sources that were generating our news are having a very difficult time economically, so where are we going to actually get real reporting?
Yeah, well, it certainly does seem like local news has been hit really hard, local newspapers, because they had the double whammy of the internet erupted right at the time that the recession hit, and I think they're still recovering. You know, the internet made it so that you no longer needed a classified section. The real estate didn't need to be done through the newspaper anymore. And at the same time, the recession made it so that advertising budgets were cut to a fraction of where they were. I think people do need to worry a little bit about local journalism, but you know, small micro news websites like the Block, it was DNA Info, but that's gone, but I think it's called like My Block or something like that. We may see more of that sort of thing, but I don't know. I don't know about the business model for local news. That's a tough one.
You worked at Chicago Tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a huge fan of the gentleman who started Chicago Tonight.
John Calloway?
John Calloway. Did you ever get a chance to meet him?
I did. Oh my gosh, he was just wonderful.
Can you talk a little about his influence on the Chicago News?
Oh my gosh, he really, really was wonderful. And he really viewed that show as, he felt like that it was a public service, a community service. And he never let that line be crossed. He really was the gold standard of somebody trying to do a local news show. And just, he was just a great guy, a great journalist. He would leave a great reader. You would get voicemail messages from him that were at 3 a.m. when you'd get in the morning and you'd have a message on your voicemail. He had just finished the book for that night's show. It was 3 a.m. and he, before he forgot, wanted to just remind you of 1 or 2 questions that he wanted to make sure, and you know, stuff like that. He was wonderful, and Phil Ponce worked with him for many years, so I know that he influenced kind of the next round of people who were there. And Phil's a great guy. Everybody who works at Chicago Tonight is lovely.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.